Hey, what's up, everyone? Chris Manning here from the Locked On Cavs podcast. We got a special guest today. It's Locked On Bucks host and ESPN Australia and New Zealand's Kane Pitman. Segment 1, what kind of prospect is Luke Travers? Segment 2, what does the NBL offer Luke Travers for development? And segment 3, how does he move forward as a prospect? Let's get into it. All right, thanks for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Remember, we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Kane, thanks so much for coming on to talk about Luke Travers with me. I want to ask you to start. Were you surprised he was drafted?
A little bit, yeah. And this is interesting. You've got a Locked On Bucks host to talk about what I would say it was like an outside draft prospect leading into the night, but I've covered him. I've covered him the last few years.
Here's the thing. I DM'd you when they drafted him. I think pretty immediately. It was like here's like one of the few people from Australia that I know, and we eventually got to talking about it. And you also, just for context, you cover the NBL in a fair amount for ESPN Australia and New Zealand. And I hate that I did this to you, but you're the Australian that I know. So I asked the Australian that I know to come through and talk about the Australian the Cavs have drafted with me.
It does make perfect sense, though. But to your question, perhaps a little bit surprised, although I think as we've seen the process play out, and we know that Luke is going to be playing back in Perth this season and back in Australia, I think it does make more sense. And for a Cavs team that they're on the rise, we believe, they've got a bunch of young players. I think a guy like Luke that clearly has development still left in him, and it's been a little bit of a strange 2 seasons playing, certainly here in Australia, we can get into that. It makes a little bit more sense because I do think long-term he does project as the type of guy that every team kind of wants. So I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, I talked to some people about him when he got drafted, and there was a little bit of surprise just because athletically he's not he doesn't jump off out of the gym. Like, he plays at his own pace. That was one of the things that was very apparent with him in Summer League. It's kind of clear that he also, from talking to people and just seeing what he had to say about himself as well and his media availability, he's physically not there yet. Like, he's still got some room to grow in terms of how strong he can be, his ability to just kind of hang an NBA through an 82-game season. I mean, people maybe not always realize this, but the schedule for other leagues around the world, and let's say specifically here the NBL in Australia, it's different. Like, it's not, you're not playing 4 games in a week. Like, the grind on your body is just different in the NBA than it is other places, and I think for the expectation from the Cavs side is that it's going to take him some time to get there. In terms of Kane, what he is as a prospect and where he is as he is drafted and kind of becomes known to the American basketball audience, is he what kind of prospect is he considered in Australia? What is the kind of the view on him from the people that have maybe seen him play for a couple of years or heard his name now for a couple of years and didn't just hear it randomly on a draft night in June?
Yeah, so he was a player that people sort of had their eyes on for a number of years. And even I had a conversation early last season with Jonathan Gavoni, the draft expert that certainly knows a lot more about prospects than I do. And he said that Travers has been on his radar for a number of years through national team, World Cups and those types of things that he played with Australia. But he really came to prominence in the 2021 NBL season, so the season before last. He was a development player, so coming into the season, it was fair enough to assume that he wasn't going to play a lot. He was able to forge a rotation on a Perth Wildcats team that is incredibly successful every single year, plays in the postseason. And they actually lost their star player right before the playoffs. And that was when Luke Travers, that was when the buzz really began, because he stepped into a pretty major role, a pretty significant role, took on more of the ball handling responsibility, the facilitation, more scoring in the postseason, and stood up really, really well. And everyone was like, well, that's really interesting and perhaps not what people expected from him that season. So last year, everyone thought that he was going to be a star. I'm not necessarily sure that this is the type of guy that he projects to be, because he is someone that just does most things really, really well. And again, when I talk about, when you talk about connectors or glue guys or players that professional teams, they all want them and they all need them, and unselfish guys that are willing to do all the little things. He was again that guy for Perth this season. Played over 20 minutes per game, again as a really young player on a team that was good. That's kind of rare in this league. We've only really seen guys like Josh Giddey, LaMelo Ball, these top prospects that have played sort of significant roles like that. So he had another pretty solid season. If you were expecting him to come out and be a 20-point per game scorer, you probably were looking at the wrong guy or expecting different things than what I did. But I thought he had a pretty good season. And he was probably on the outside looking in, but as a draft and stash guy, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, we'll get in the second segment to the NBL and to Perth and that situation, so I and others can understand it better. But it's interesting, the connector piece and the not star piece is also like what he said about himself, which I think is look, sometimes that's very rare in guys that are 20. Like they think higher of themselves, they have higher aspirations, and he was like, I consider myself to be like a Joe Ingles type, and that also could be maybe a little bit of let me explain myself to these Americans via this Australian that they can very much like. There could be some of that there. I'm not gonna like write that off as a thing, but you watched him play in summer league and it was okay, this guy's not gonna shot hunt for himself. He's gonna play at his own pace, he's gonna move the ball, he's gonna defend. Like you can see that template very much there. And Kane, like I look at that, and even if this isn't like, I understand maybe like people want higher upside swings, and I think a lot of teams do that as well. I can like understand how if you say this isn't a play for right now, but this is the kind of guy that in 2 years, let's say, we can maybe bring over and he can look good and compete, and this is the kind of thing every team needs. I kind of don't hate like that template of a guy is a guy you kind of roll the dice on if it's going to be a draft and stash situation. It's not like they had the roster room anyway. It's not like there's anyone that maybe is like meaningfully better really even available here. It just seems like a smart play and a guy who could be a smart basketball player. That seems to be the rationale on what picking Travers signifies.
Yeah, I think his floor is pretty high. And this is something that I've, and when I say that in terms of, again, if you're talking about an NBA role player, like I think that's a legitimate, possibility for this guy, that he comes in and becomes a guy that you can play every night. And let's be honest, if you're a contending team, which the Cavs hope that they will be over the next couple of years, the next 3 to 4 seasons, moving into that upper echelon in the East, every team that is contending ultimately needs guys, whether they're coming off the bench or that sort of 4th or 5th starter, that they can just rely on every single night. And he mentioned a guy like Joe Ingles. Now, that would be a pretty incredible scenario if he gets to, sort of peak Joe Ingles, particularly from a shooting perspective. But again, his awareness and willingness to the last 2 seasons do everything that he needed to do to help that team win without trying to do too much, understanding that he was on the sort of fringe of the draft process, and he still didn't worry. He understood that, okay, if I do these things, NBA teams, if they're drafting late in the second round, if you're picking someone up, pick 56, the chances of you getting an all-star, they're pretty low. But if you get a guy that ultimately becomes an NBA role player, that's incredible value late in the second round. So it's not to say there isn't more development left in him, because I think there clearly is. You mentioned physically. We've spoken about the shooting. And I just think on this year's Perth team, as you said, we'll talk about it in the second segment, but I think in this year's Perth team, again, you're going to see his numbers go up. He played 10 minutes per game in the 2021 season. That went up to 20 plus. He's going to be a 25-minute per night guy playing in the NBL this season. And I think if you're the Cavs, the NBL has become a development ground and a development league. And I think it's clearly better for him to be playing big minutes on a good NBL team than potentially just sitting on the bench in the NBA.
Yeah, or even I think the question I think we'll ask in segment 2, or I'll ask is this better than, let's say, a season in the G League? And I tend to think it probably is. All right, after the break, we'll talk about the NBL, talk about the Perth Wildcats, what Travers' situation is there. But first, going to tell everyone about our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, the NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. Right now, for example, the Cavs are minus 125 to finish with fewer than 44 wins and minus 105 to finish with more than 44 wins. And over in the Defensive Player of the Year race, Evan Mobley is plus 1,600 to win the award next season. So there are other Cavs lines if you're interested in other Cavs-related things. There's Bucks line, there's other NBA futures, there's everything at BetOnline. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, back here on Locked On Cavs with Kane Pitman from Locked On Bucks from ESPN Australia and New Zealand. Kane, if I was I'm asking you as an outsider, someone who has, watched the LaMelo clips, watched the Giddey clips, now done the Travers deep dives, and seen clips here and there. For someone who understands the league the way you do, what is the competition level in the NBL like right now? And what kind of situation is Travers in as far as what kind of competition he's going against?
Yeah, the last 3 or 4 years, it's risen astronomically. And I remember to the point, and I was based in Milwaukee from around 2017 through to the pandemic, basically. And before I moved to Milwaukee, I didn't watch the NBL. I was just like, I don't need to watch this league. And while I was over in the US, more and more people started to ask about the NBL, and you take more notice. And then when I've came back, even in this 2 to 3 seasons, it's a really high quality competition that is non-NBA. And I think the best way to look at how the NBA views players that are developed in the NBL is to just purely look at the draft prospects that have come out of there. Now, I already mentioned LaMelo Ball. He was highly rated, but his prospects did go up by playing in the NBL. Josh Giddey certainly rose in the draft ranks as Ousmane Dieng was a top 11 pick this year in a draft. Even a guy like Jock Landale, who was a little bit older, but played in Melbourne. He went to the Spurs. Now he's with the Phoenix Suns. So there, I could keep going down the list. So I think if you looked at this a few years ago, would NBA teams be saying, okay, let's draft and stash a guy in Australia? We'd never really seen that before. But now teams are sitting back and saying, we feel super comfortable that we can draft this guy, send him to the NBL. He's going to be around NBA quality coaches and NBA quality players, to be honest. Every team in the NBL basically has guys that have either played in the NBA, played in the G League recently. So it's a really high quality competition, and it's certainly not a league that, a guy like Luke Travers at the age of 18, 19, when he first came into the league, you're just simply not going to dominate. When you spoke about the physical growth that he needs to go through, he's going to get that playing in the NBL. So yeah, it's taken major steps in recent years. It wants to strive to be on the same level as the G League, the top European leagues. That's really hard to compare, but I think the NBA eyes are definitely on the NBL.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the grind of the season, in frankly also probably the money part of it for Travers, particularly like there was not a full roster contract available to him with the Cavs, and a lot of times I think if you get that 15th roster spot, whether it's Cleveland, Milwaukee, a team that's bad like the Rockets or whatever, if you're the 15th guy, even, you don't really always get the G League time. They keep you around for depth. You don't get to play. In the G League, it seems like he's part of the thing here with him is he wants to play, and I kind of tend to favor that over him just getting to like sit around, for a year. Like, he's 20, he should be playing. So looking at Perth, when I did my quick Google searches to prep for this podcast, they have a new head coach, John Riley. I believe I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Replacing Scott Morrison. What can you tell us about Perth, about this new head coach? What is going on with the situation that Travers is going to find himself in next year?
Yeah, John Riley, back in, you'd say, the prime of the NBL in Australia through the 90s, he was a superstar in this league, but he spent the last decade coaching in the college system in the US. So he's a highly experienced coach. And now he comes to Perth this year. And Perth's in an interesting spot because prior to last season, they were the Spurs of the NBL. They'd made the postseason 35 years in a row. And last year was the first season that they missed the playoffs in that time. So there's been a bit of change with the club, but they're going to be really good. They are consistently a super competitive team. So Luke will be one of the prime defenders in this team. I expect that he's mostly come off the bench. I think that he'll start this season for this team, and as I said, play at 25 plus minutes. And again, I would expect the numbers to go up. But if you look, Perth 36 last year, he played around 22 minutes. Keeping in mind that NBL is only 40-minute games. You get the 10-minute quarters, the FIBA rules. But per 36 last year was 13 points, 9 rebounds, 4 assists, a block and a steal per game. And that to me is who Luke Travers is. Does a little bit of everything on both plays. We spoke about the athleticism. He doesn't play with his head above the rim, but he's pretty quick-footed. Like he blocks well for his size. He's always in the passing lanes, collecting steals and creating plays defensively. So I think if you're a Cavs fan, the best part about this is that he's always going to be playing meaningful basketball because Perth are a really good team. He'll probably be in the postseason. And to your point, I think that makes a lot of sense for the Cavs. And the other point I would say is the NBL season, it's been a little bit different the last 2 years because of COVID has pushed the season back. But this year, the season is tipping off on October 1, and it'll be done by the end of February. So we have seen this a little bit in recent years, and it probably depends where the Cavs are. They might be a little bit too good to consider this, but there is an option depending on what the roster positions are like on the Cavs, that he could also come over to the US for the back end of the season as well, which, again, we've seen with some players recently.
Yeah, I wonder, like, honestly, I don't know, but, like, I kind of wonder what the league rules would be, even if he, like, couldn't be signed to a contract. If it's like, hey, your season's done. I wonder, like, I almost think I'm going to have to ask someone now if it's, like, legal. If, like, let's say they play until then, he's healthy, maybe he takes 2 weeks off and, like, goes on vacation or something. Right. Or even doesn't. He's young. He can handle it. It's not like me at, like, 30 who's, like, ready to just, like, throw up into a ball after do anything. Could he, like, come to the States for a couple weeks and, like, train then? Is that like, a legal path? Because that would also make a ton of sense. Even if he just comes then and is, like, around, because they have his rights, but, like, I wonder if that's, like, considered tampering or something. Not that they really enforce tampering all that much, but, like... well, I guess they did for the team you cover, the Bucks, but like in most cases they don't usually cover tampering, and then it's like second round pick, whatever. But yeah, I wonder how that would work, because like I think there was interest in having him come to camp. It seems like they wanted him to come to camp, but it was also like we can't like guarantee we're going to give you a roster spot. I think it's pretty clear that he like went back and is going to prioritize playing, which I think makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I think it's just also the clash with probably the seasons. Like if he goes to training camp in the NBA, you're missing the first few weeks of the season over here. So it probably didn't make a lot of sense timing wise if he wants to play. Because I know a lot of these teams, they're starting their training camp literally next week, or probably about a month ahead of where the NBA is.
Yeah, he spent like 3 weeks, or it should be like 3 months in the U.S. or something in L.A. before the draft. So I don't think he'd been home in a while, and I think he probably also it seemed like he wanted to like go home and decompress. All right, after the break, we're going to talk about the developmental plan for Travers. What's next for him, the things he needs to work on, and perhaps what a reasonable time for him to come over would be. That's coming up next. All right, last segment here with Kane Pitman, Locked on Bucks, NBA, Australia, New Zealand. Kane, I wanna start with the shooting part of his game, because to me, this isn't like new. This is unique to him. This is unique to I think a lot of wings now. The shooting thing is gonna really raise his ceiling or lower it, I think, because he has a lot of the skills that you could say this guy could play 3-4 for us. He can be a really good defender for us. If he's like 25%, I think from 3 last year, nothing great, like pretty low. If it could get up to 35%, then that's a big leap. But if it could get there, if he can become a comfortable shooter, that feels to me like the thing where he goes from like pretty interesting all around guy who like maybe you have to find a unique role for, to a guy that clicks a little bit more, to a guy that has a much clearer path to this, right? Like that seems to me to be the swing skill for Travers when I'm looking at him and have watched him and have looked at his numbers. Does that track to you when I say that?
Yeah, I think your first point is great, because I always feel like a bit of a fraud. Like if I'm talking about prospects and people are like, what does he need to do? And I'm like, well, he needs to work on his shot, because you're right. If for guys, that is often the difference between being an NBA player or being a really high quality international player, which to be honest, he already is. The thing I like or liked last season from Travers, and I'm not sure, I don't have the numbers in front of me from Summer League. I think he knocked down a couple threes, but I'm not sure where he was at or if you noticed this. But the thing that stood out to me last year was 2 seasons ago, he was at around 0.8 3-point attempts per game. Probably pretty reluctant to get them up. Last year, it went up to 2.5 per game, which again, like he's only playing 20 minutes per game. That's a significant jump. But the thing that I liked is that some of the threes that he made, and I remember specifically a couple of games where it's really late in the fourth quarter, really tight games against really good opposition, and he would take and make the shots. And it was almost this weird situation where it felt like the threes that he was hitting always came in big moments, which I think is significant because we've obviously seen players before that aren't necessarily consistent jump shooters, so they're reluctant to shoot, which isn't the case with him. And it does remind me a little bit of Josh Giddey the season before, and I know you mentioned the Ingles thing. I don't want to be making lazy comparisons, but Giddey was the same. His shooting was, and LaMelo Ball for that fact. I mean, these guys were not consistent shooters. It was a big question mark coming into the league, but they were willing shooters, and I think that is almost as important because you feel like if they're willing to work, they're willing to allow themselves to fail in games. Then you have faith that the development will come. So I don't think his shot necessarily looks bad. And as I said, he did hit some big ones through the season.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Giddey, I just looked it up, was like 4.5 threes per game last year. Like, that's just willing to let it go. They just hired Chip Engelland, so like they just hired maybe the greatest 3-point shooting coach of all time in Oklahoma City. So good for Giddey. He's probably gonna maybe figure that out then. But yeah, when I check in on Travers this year, the thing will be like, is he shooting? Because like watching him at Summer League, Kane, like I was really, really impressed by pretty much everything else. Like very aware, very much like comfortable at his own pace, very much willing to move the ball and try to make passes. And like you saw him get beat physically sometimes. You saw him have a strength disadvantage at times that you can just say like this guy needs like time in the weight room, time to like grow into his frame and get bigger because he's pretty slender right now. But like everything else, it's like this guy feels like he kind of understands how to play, and it's not going to be a concern of okay, like can he like learn how to like there's so many prospects, it feels like, where it's like, okay, can this guy like learn how to dribble? Can this guy learn how to like pass at a competent level or whatever? It doesn't feel like that's going to be the issue with Travers. It just feels like how well-rounded can he get? How much can he like smooth out the edges to his game as he gets bigger? And also like, what does the shooting look like? And if the shooting like pans out at all, it's like, There's a dude waiting to be had there. Whether it's with the Cavs, whether he has like a great international career in some way, like there's a very clear path to me when I watch him to say like this guy should just be a pro for a long time, and that ceiling just gets higher and higher if he hits some threes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting with guys that come across for Summer League, and it's always the case. And we've all watched enough Summer League that sometimes you see guys that are, they're trying super hard and they're trying to stand out. They're trying to do things because they want to show out, and this is extremely meaningful for their career. So I always understand why that's the case, but I always notice guys that just play the way they play. And to me, when I watched Travers playing with the Cavs, I was like, all right, this is a guy that's just playing basketball. Like this, he's playing the exact same way that he played in the NBL. He's not trying to do too much. And some of those interviews were interesting. I think you're right. I think part of it was him trying to explain the way he plays. And there was probably parts of him that wanted to have more on the box score or produce more stats. And there was probably some things that he would like to change. But ultimately, I think what you saw at Summer League, hopefully there will continue to be development as a scorer and a passer and those types of things. But I think you saw a lot of Luke Travers of what we've seen here in the NBL and what I expect to see this season. He's just a really solid basketball player across the board.
Let's end on this. What is to you a reasonable time for him to come over? You mentioned the possibility, okay, the season ends before the NBA season ends. Maybe there's a roster spot. Maybe there's a need he could come over then. Is there a time frame otherwise, whether it's that or something else, that makes sense to you as far as when he might make sense to come over?
I think it ultimately depends, and as much as I've just spoken about how much of a role guy he is and he does bits of everything, I think it does depend on where his scoring goes this season. Does he become a guy that Perth can rely on more to score? Can he be not necessarily a go-to guy, but can he push that scoring up to sort of that 15-point range, which for the NBL, again, 40-minute games, is a pretty substantial mark? Because I think if you're the Cavs, as much as I've said that the NBL is an improving league, you kind of want to see some dominant games from Luke Travers, I think, this year. to then have the confidence to say, okay, well, look, you'll come back. Let's do summer league again next season, and then let's bring you to training camp and see if you can be with the team. So I think another season with the Wildcats makes sense. It'll be basically his third full season in the league. There'll also be no disruptions. It's been so weird. Last year, they were on the road for, I think, 2 months straight because they couldn't get back to their home state because of COVID restrictions. The year before, the season was starting and stopping and starting over and over, like a lot of leagues. So, hopefully this year there's just some normalcy to what the league is trying to get through the schedule as well, which I think will help him. So I think if he can take a next step in terms of being close to a star for this Wildcats team this year in the NBL, I could see him being at training camp next year.
Yeah, I think that's the timeline, not even just for that for what you outlined, but I think also from the Cavs from roster perspective, like Jetty Osman's contract's up, LeVert's contract's up, Dylan Windler's contract's up. Like they're gonna have guys coming off the books and have a need for someone who's like a cost-effective, perhaps useful player, and like he would make some sense. And it's also still a development play. If he comes over next year, he's still 21 years old. He can come over then, and there's still time to develop. You could put him down in the G League at times if you needed to that year. But then there's also I would say, this is like a question that like maybe it would be interesting to ask Ingles like in retrospect, but the Cavs have talked about like getting Travers like in the weight room and getting him on like a more American style lifting program. That's one of the things that when you ask them about him that they've said. I wonder if so obviously that's not saying you can't like lift in Australia because you can, but one of the things it's like I wonder if they would like to get him in their program sooner rather than later to like mold his body in some way, because like that way they just have more over like that's not like something you like trade one of the guys now to clear roster spots to do that. And then obviously Travers seems to want to go back overseas, and I think that was the plan from the moment they drafted him. But there's that little factor I wonder. It's like, okay, would they like to bring him over sooner rather than later if they believe that there's an NBA player here just because they get him under their eye, they get him in their system, they get him training with them all the time, and they can help mold his body in the way they would want to, instead of him having to figure it out kind of on his own in some ways.
Yeah, that's why I wonder if, the age factor, they just feel, okay, we think that there's something here, but he's not quite ready. And I think that's fine. I think he would admit that as well. Go back to Perth, have a good season, because if you compare him to other Australian guys that have gone to the NBA recently, I already mentioned Jock Landale, but he was 25, 26, and he played a few games last year, looked really competent at the level. Another guy that is kind of an interesting comparison to Luke Travers. He played Jack White. He went to Duke. I'm not sure if any of your listeners remember Jack White. He didn't play a lot, but he went to Denver in Summer League, and they signed him to a two-way. So he's going to be in that system, whether or not he's playing NBA or whether he's playing G League. But again, he's 24. So I think the age difference, definitely the Cavs probably feel like there's some time. But I would imagine by the time he gets to 21, his 22 season, to your point, I think it's like, okay, let's have a season with this guy under our eyes every single day and see what we've got. So it makes total sense to me that they're happy for him to be over here for another year. But I think at some point they obviously like him. They'll want to get a good look.
Kane, thank you so much for coming through, talking about Luke Travers with me in the doldrums of the NBA offseason. Anything you got talking about on Locked On Bucks? Any ESPN Australia, New Zealand stuff you want to plug? Anything we should cover before we get out of here?
Well, look, as your listeners probably also believe, we're definitely on the path to Bucks and Cavs Eastern Conference Finals. So
Darius Garland did say that he believes the Cavs can get there this year. So that maybe that's where they think they're at. I'm a little unsure. I did just Google George Hill because I've been thinking about George Hill lately. So that's
you want him back?
Brain's at. Nah, I would rather have Delly back just for vibes. The Delly vibes were much higher than the George Hill vibes in terms of like me talking to him and covering and how the vibes were with that.
It's funny you say mention Delly as we wrap this up. It's funny you mentioned Delly because the one thing I think I tweeted it or I definitely wrote about it after the draft was there's no surprise that the Cavs have looked at an Australian guy that does all the little things, will dive on the floor, will play tough, probably beyond his size and physical capabilities, given the history of the Cavs. It made some sense to me why they would want to bring in another guy like that.
Yeah, he got asked about, as you would expect, he got asked about Delhi like 7. It was like
Sure.
Ingles and Delhi like were probably the 2 biggest questions he got asked, and he's like, Delhi actually called me and like told me where to eat and stuff, and I, whether that was lip service or not, at least like the plug came through. I actually had forgot. Sacrilegious of me as a Clevelander, but I'd forgotten about Delhi for a while, and then last year when that clip of him getting absolutely dunked on went around, I was like, goodness. Oh, Delhi, hey, he's still there, still hanging out. Good stuff.
He's but the thing we know about Delhi, he would try and block that shot again for some reason. Who knows? But he would do it. He's willing to get on the poster.
Dude drank so much coffee before a game he had to get an IV after. One of one figure in the league. Kane, it's gonna be a pleasure. We'll talk when we get NBA basketball back. Cavs Bucks will be fun this year. I'm very excited to watch year 2 Evan Mobley continue to try to guard Giannis, and that is a litmus test. Drew Holiday and Darius Garland. It will be fun. I also like need do you like me need like 2 more months of like just calm before we get there, or are you ready? Are you ready for some games?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got here in Australia, we've got the Women's World Cup coming up in just over a month, and then that leads into the start of the Australian season, which leads into the NBA. So I've got about 3 weeks left, and then it's full swing for 6 months. So let's enjoy this.
Yeah, I will. That will be how I'm feeling when I'm double dipping NBA games and
that's right.
World Cup games in like November, when I'm like
exactly right
plotting my NBA schedule versus like when I can watch like the various World Cup games I watch. All right, Locked on Cavs. We'll be back tomorrow. Antonio Daniels will be on Locked on NBA expert Antonio Daniels talking about Colin Sexton, because that's still going on, and Mark Schindler is going to come on to talk about that as well, because it's late July, and Colin Sexton's literally the only thing going on there. Who knows what's going to happen there? Hopefully he doesn't. For my sakes, I hope he doesn't sign a contract before I get those podcasts out, because got to do some content. But until next time, I'm Chris. Thanks again to Kane for coming through, everyone. Be well.